Looky here. Another lonely widow. Melissa's laugh cut through the quiet church like a knife. Heads turned. My cheeks burned as if a spotlight had landed on me. I froze in the pew, clutching the hymnal in my lap. People whispered. Some even smirked. My son Daniel sat beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the floor. He didn't say a word, and in that silence the sting of her words grew sharper, like salt rubbed into an open wound. For a moment I wondered if this was how the rest of my days would be measured, by the cruel laughter of the woman who had married my only son. I forced myself to stay still. Leaving would only feed their gossip. The pastor's voice faltered for a second, as if even he didn't know how to move past the insult. I felt 100 eyes weighing down on me. Every breath was heavy. Melissa leaned closer to Daniel and whispered something I couldn't hear, but the curl of her lips told me enough. She was proud of what she had said. She wanted me broken. I looked at my son, silently begging him to defend me, to remind his wife that respect belonged in this place. But he didn't lift his head. His silence hurt worse than her words. It told me something I had feared for a long time, that Melissa's voice carried more weight in his heart than mine ever could. When the service ended, people filed out slowly. Some offered me soft nods of pity, but no one dared to speak. I kept my hands folded, willing them not to tremble. Melissa was already at the door, greeting neighbors as though she hadn't just torn me down in front of them. Her laugh rang out again, light and airy, as if she were the heroine of her own story. Daniel followed behind her, his shoulders stiff, his face unreadable. Outside, the autumn air was cool, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant smoke from a chimney. Melissa's heels clicked against the stone steps. She turned back, her eyes meeting mine with a look that was both daring and dismissive. Then she said, loud enough for others to hear, "You'll be fine, Clara. Old women like you always find a way to get by, until the farm slips out of your hands." That farm. 920 acres of soil, vines, and sweat. My husband and I had built it from nothing but hope and grit. Every inch carried his memory, his work, his dreams. And now his widow stood in the cold, being mocked by the woman who believed she would inherit it all. I wanted to speak. I wanted to remind her that land cannot be bought with cruelty. But my throat tightened. The words stayed trapped. I saw Daniel glance back at me, his eyes flickering with something. Doubt, anger, shame, I couldn't tell. Then he turned and walked away beside her. I stayed behind on the church steps, waiting until the crowd thinned. The sky was grey, the kind that pressed low and heavy, threatening rain. My body felt the same. Heavy, pressed down, aching with the weight of loneliness. When I finally started toward my truck, an old neighbor touched my arm. "Don't mind her," he said quietly. "People like that don't last." I tried to smile, but it came out hollow. I didn't believe it. Melissa wasn't just people. She was family now, bound to me by Daniel, by a marriage I hadn't been able to stop. And family, when it turns cruel, has a way of lasting longer than any storm. On the drive home, the silence of the truck wrapped around me. The road stretched ahead, lined with the bare vines of the vineyard. I gripped the wheel tighter, memories pressed in, my husband's hands planting those first rows, the long summers of harvest, the way we used to laugh over a shared glass of wine at dusk. Now the land stood like a question mark, and the answer seemed to rest in Melissa's smirk. I parked near the farmhouse and sat there a while, staring at the wide porch where my husband once rocked in the evenings. The place felt empty, not just of him, but of Daniel, too. My son's silence in that church told me what I didn't want to admit. He was slipping further from me, caught in the grip of the woman who had just laughed at his mother in front of God and everyone else. I whispered to myself, "This isn't the end. It can't be." My voice shook, but I clung to the sound of it. I had been mocked, humiliated, left to stand alone. But I wasn't ready to hand over the life I had built. Not to Melissa, not to anyone. The service was over. The church was behind me. But the sting of her words would not fade. They would drive me. They would remind me that silence has its limits, and mine had been reached. The farm has always been the heart of my life. 920 acres of vines stretching across the Texas soil, each row carrying the memory of the man I built it with. My husband and I had started with nothing but a small loan and more determination than sense. We lived in a trailer on the edge of the land in those early years. He worked the soil with his bare hands, while I kept the books and learned how to prune vines from old neighbors who had done it all their lives. Every bottle of wine we produced was a victory. Every acre we managed to expand felt like a gift we had carved out of the earth itself. When he passed in that accident last year, the silence of the farm changed. The machines still hummed, the workers still showed up, the grapes still ripened in the sun, but everything felt muted. I ran the business the way we had always done, steady and practical, but without his presence, I felt like half of me had been buried with him. Daniel grew up among these vines. As a boy, he would run barefoot down the rows, carrying a stick like it was a sword. He learned how to fix a fence before he learned how to drive. When he went off to college, I told myself it was good for him to see life beyond the farm. I hoped he would come back with new ideas, a way to carry our legacy into the future. But life rarely bends the way we expect. He became a civil engineer and built a life in the city. It was only after marrying Melissa that Daniel began to drift further away from me. She had a sharp tongue and sharper ambitions. She liked to talk about numbers and potential, how the land could be sold off piece by piece for more money than we could make in a decade of harvests. I told her once that land was not just numbers on paper, that it held memory, sweat, and family. She looked at me like I was speaking a language she did not care to understand. Since my husband's death, Melissa had grown bolder. She visited the farm often, speaking as if she already owned it. She would run her hand over the porch railing and say things like, "This place could use a remodel," or "A resort would fit nicely here." She never spoke of vines or soil, never of family, only money. I tried to smile through her remarks, for Daniel's sake. I did not want to drive him further from me, but each time she spoke that way, I felt the distance between us stretch a little more. The truth is, Daniel has always been torn. He loves this land. I know he does. When he walks through the rows of vines, I see something soften in him. But Melissa has a way of pulling at him, convincing him that what he feels is just nostalgia, that progress is worth more than history. And now, with his father gone, her voice seemed louder than ever. That Sunday after church, when Melissa laughed at me in front of everyone, I realized how much ground I had already lost. The whispers of the neighbors reminded me of it. They remembered my husband as a proud man, and me as the woman who stood by him. Now they saw me as the widow too weak to fight back. Melissa's words had not only humiliated me, they had planted doubt in the minds of the community. Doubt about my strength, about my future, about whether I could still protect what we had built. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the old ledger books spread out in front of me. The numbers were neat, the handwriting steady from years of keeping every detail in order. Each page told a story of harvests gained and debts paid, of growth slow but steady. I traced the ink with my finger and remembered the arguments I had with my husband in those early days, when we had nothing but risk and hope. He had always believed the farm would outlast us. Now it was up to me to make sure it did. I poured myself a glass of our oldest vintage and stared out the window. The moonlight fell over the vines, silver and still. Somewhere out there, the soil held more than roots. It held promises, promises made between two young people who wanted a life built on work and faith, not greed. I whispered to myself, "This land is not hers. It never will be." Daniel came by the next day, Melissa at his side. She walked through the kitchen without knocking, her perfume filling the room before she even spoke. She glanced at the ledgers on the table and smirked. "Still using those old books? You should switch to a digital system, more efficient." I smiled faintly, refusing to rise to her bait. Daniel sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes moving between us. I could feel the tension pressing down on him. He wanted peace, but peace is a fragile thing when one person is always pushing to take more. Melissa leaned against the counter and said, "Daniel and I have been talking. You know the farm is too much for you to manage alone. It might be time to hand over the reins." I looked at her steadily, then at my son. His eyes dropped again. He could not meet mine. My heart ached, but my voice stayed calm. "The farm is not a burden. It is my life. When I am ready, Daniel will know, but not before." Melissa's lips curled into that same smile she wore in church, the one that said she believed she had already won. She pushed away from the counter and took Daniel's arm. "We will see," she said softly, as though the decision had already been made. When they left, the silence of the house pressed in. I stood there a long time, my hands resting on the ledger books. I thought about the years of sacrifice, the mornings before dawn, the long summers when we worked until our hands bled. I thought about how easily Melissa dismissed it all, as if history could be sold off like a parcel of land. I walked to the porch and looked out over the vines. The sun was sinking low, casting a golden glow across the rows. For a moment I let myself believe that the land itself was listening, that it understood. I whispered to the fields the way I once whispered to my husband. "They will not take you, not while I still breathe." The wind stirred gently through the leaves, carrying the promise back to me. The following Friday evening, the community centre held its usual gathering. It was nothing formal, just neighbours coming together after a long week, sharing food, catching up on news, sometimes talking about farm matters. I had gone for years with my husband, and even after his passing, I kept showing up. It was part of our life, and I felt he would have wanted me to continue. That night, I arrived a little later than usual. The room was already filled with chatter and laughter, the smell of casseroles and cornbread drifting through the air. Melissa was standing near the front, her voice carrying above the others. I heard her before I saw her. "Clara still thinks she can run all those acres alone," she said, loud enough for several people to hear. "At her age, it is just a matter of time before the land falls apart. Daniel and I are the only ones who can keep it alive." A few people chuckled nervously, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one challenged her. I walked in quietly, setting my dish on the long table, pretending not to notice. Inside, though, my stomach clenched. Her words were not careless. They were deliberate, meant to chip away at my reputation. I found a seat near the back. Daniel was there too, but he stayed close to Melissa, hovering beside her as if he could shield her words from being questioned. His face was tight, his eyes darting toward me now and then, but he never spoke up. As the evening went on, Melissa grew bolder. She told a group near the punch bowl that the farm was too much for me, that I was drowning in paperwork and decisions. She spoke of vines that would die without new management, of equipment I could no longer handle. Each sentence landed like a stone thrown at my back. I knew the truth. The farm was running fine, the books balanced, the workers respected me, but her words were not about truth. They were about perception, and perception could be dangerous. At one point, she lifted her glass and said, "It is sad when someone cannot see that their time has passed. Sometimes the hardest thing is letting go." I sat very still, my hands folded on my lap. I wanted to rise and defend myself, to say the land was mine, that I had earned every acre with sweat and sacrifice, but I stayed quiet. Arguing in that moment would only feed her story, make me look defensive, maybe even bitter. Instead, I let her talk, let her voice fill the room like smoke. Still, the shame was heavy. I saw the glances from neighbors, pity mixed with curiosity. I knew what they were thinking. Was she right? Could I really keep going without my husband by my side? I excused myself to the restroom just to breathe. Standing at the sink, I splashed cold water on my face. I looked at my reflection, the lines etched deeper by grief and responsibility. My husband used to tell me I had strength in me I did not even recognize. In that moment, I tried to find it, to believe it still lived somewhere under the weariness. When I returned, I found Daniel sitting alone at a table. Melissa had gone off to talk to another group. I took the seat across from him. He didn't look up right away. His fingers tapped lightly against the wood. Finally, he said, "She thinks she is helping, Mum. She believes she is protecting me from being stuck cleaning up after the farm when—" He stopped, but the word hung between us. When I was gone. I swallowed hard. "Daniel, I am not gone. I am standing here, running this place, keeping it alive. Does she really believe tearing me down in front of everyone is helping you?" He looked at me then, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I don't agree with everything she says, but she worries. She thinks the farm is too big for one person." I leaned closer, keeping my voice steady. "I am not one person. I have workers, neighbors, people who believe in what your father and I built. What she is doing is not worry, Daniel. It is ambition, and ambition can be cruel." He shifted in his chair, but he didn't answer. Before we could continue, Melissa returned, sliding her arm through his and smiling sweetly at me as if nothing had happened. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I heard more whispers, more little jabs slipped into conversation. By the time I walked out into the night air, my chest felt tight. The sky was clear, stars bright overhead, but I felt small beneath them. Driving home, I replayed her words. Each one echoed like a hammer striking the walls of my resolve. She wanted the community to doubt me, to believe I was slipping. If enough of them believed it, Daniel would too. And then the farm, the home I had built with my husband, might slide from my grasp without a fight. I parked by the house and sat for a long time in the truck. The fields stretched out in the dark, silent and watchful. I told myself Melissa's voice could not change the truth of the soil, the strength of the vines, the years of history written into every row. But I also knew words could be powerful weapons. Tonight I had felt their sting, sharper than any blade. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my shoes, and walked slowly up to the porch. The night air was cool, the silence deep. For the first time, I wondered if my quiet endurance was enough. Melissa was not just attacking me. She was planting seeds of doubt in everyone around me. Seeds, if left unchecked, that could grow into something strong enough to uproot everything I had left. That night, the house felt colder than usual. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a yellow glow over the ledger books still spread before me. The pages blurred as my eyes welled up, but I refused to let the tears fall. I had promised myself long ago that crying would never solve anything. Still, the weight of Melissa's words, the laughter of neighbours, and Daniel's silence pressed hard on me. The farm was steady, the workers loyal, but my heart felt like it was unravelling. I closed the books and carried my glass of water to the living room. The old armchair still smelled faintly of my husband's cologne, though it had been over a year since he last sat there. I ran my hand along the fabric and whispered, "You always knew how to make me feel stronger. I wish you were here tonight." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Upstairs, the window in our old bedroom rattled lightly against the wind. I climbed the steps slowly, each creak echoing in the stillness. The bed looked too big without him. I sat down on the edge and stared at the photograph on the nightstand. His smile looked back at me, warm and steady, reminding me of the years we fought through droughts, storms, and debt. We had always made it through side by side. Now it was just me, holding on while Melissa chipped away at everything we had built. I thought about Daniel. He had been my joy, the reason I worked so hard through the hardest seasons. I wanted to believe he still saw me as the mother who had carried him through late nights of homework and scraped knees. But lately, when I looked at him, I saw hesitation. I saw a man torn between his wife and his mother, leaning more toward the one who whispered promises of control and wealth. Lying back on the bed, I closed my eyes. Sleep did not come. Instead, I heard again Melissa's voice from the community center, sharp and mocking. I saw the way Daniel's head dropped when I asked him if she thought humiliation was help. My chest tightened, and for the first time since my husband died, I felt the sting of loneliness deeper than grief. It was not just that he was gone. It was that the family I still had seemed to be slipping away too. The next morning I rose before dawn, as always. The farm waited, indifferent to my pain. The vines stretched toward the horizon, steady as they had been the day before. I walked the rows, the dew clinging to my shoes, the cool air biting at my cheeks. I tried to draw strength from the land, to remind myself that life continues, even when hearts falter. Still, the ache inside me did not fade. Later that afternoon, Daniel came by, alone this time. He stood in the kitchen doorway, his shoulders tense. "Mom," he began, but his voice trailed off. I looked at him, waiting. He shifted, then said, "Melissa thinks you should consider selling part of the land, just a small section. It would ease the load on you." I felt my breath catch. "Daniel, do you believe that? Do you think I cannot handle this?" He hesitated. His eyes flickered toward the floor. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed." The words should have comforted me, but instead they cut deeper. Overwhelmed. That was how he saw me now. I turned away, walking to the sink. "Your father and I worked this land for decades. Do you think I am suddenly incapable because I am alone?" He said nothing. The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy. When I finally turned back, his face was tight with conflict. He wanted to defend me, but I could see the doubt Melissa had planted. It was there, like a shadow behind his eyes. After he left, I sat on the porch until the sun slipped below the horizon. The cicadas buzzed in the distance, the fields bathed in gold. I remembered sitting here with my husband, sipping sweet tea after a long day. He would squeeze my hand and say, "As long as we stand together, nothing can break us." Now I sat alone, my hands empty, and wondered if Melissa had already broken the bond I thought would last forever. That night I wrote in my journal, the words spilling faster than I could catch them. I wrote about the laughter in church, the whispers in the community hall, the silence of my son. I wrote about the fear of losing not just the farm, but the only family I had left. And when the ink smudged from the tears I could no longer hold back, I realized the truth. The pain was not just from Melissa's cruelty, it was from Daniel's hesitation, his unwillingness to stand beside me. That was the wound I could not stop from bleeding. Before I closed the book, I wrote one last line. I cannot let her win, but I do not know how much longer I can fight alone. The lamp flickered as I set the pen down. Outside, the wind rustled the vines. The farm would endure. But I, sitting there in the quiet, wondered if I still had the strength to endure with it. A few days later, Daniel stopped by the house again. He said he needed to look through some of his father's old tools that were still in the shed. I watched him from the porch as he sorted through boxes, his face distant, his hands slow. I could tell he was carrying more than just the weight of memories. Something was on his mind, something he had not yet said. When he finally came inside, he brought a box with him. He set it on the table, dust rising as he opened the lid. Inside were papers, old receipts, and some insurance forms I had not seen in years. He flipped through them until one page made him pause. His brow furrowed. He stared at it longer than the rest. I asked quietly, "What is it, Daniel?" He slid the paper toward me. It was a life insurance policy, dated just 2 years before his father died. The amount was clear, $250,000. But what made my stomach twist was the beneficiary line. It listed Melissa, not me, not Daniel. Her name written neatly in ink. I felt the air leave my lungs. Why would your father name her? My voice shook. This doesn't make sense. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He wouldn't have. He never trusted paperwork like this without showing it to you first. He flipped the page over, studying the signatures. His jaw tightened. Mum, this is strange. Melissa was listed before he even passed. And the timing, it doesn't feel right. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. I remembered the night of the accident, how sudden it had been. He had gone into town, and then the sheriff came to the door with the news. I had asked no questions at the time. I was too broken, too lost in grief. Now, with this paper in front of me, the cracks in that night began to widen. Daniel rubbed his temples. I never told you, but the night Dad died, Melissa disappeared for a few hours. She said she was visiting a friend, but when I asked who, she brushed it off. I didn't think much of it then. Now I wonder if she was near the scene. The words hit me hard. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Daniel, you cannot throw accusations without proof. I know, he said, his voice low. But I also know Melissa. She is smart, and she is careful. If she wanted to make sure this policy paid out to her, she would find a way. I wanted to reject it, to believe that even with all her cruelty, Melissa could not have gone that far. But the thought lodged itself deep in me. The woman who mocked me in church, who whispered to neighbors that I was weak, now stood connected to a policy that should never have been hers. Daniel folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his jacket pocket. I need to look deeper, he said. I can check with the insurance office, maybe find out when the beneficiary was changed. And I want to see if anyone remembers where Melissa was that night. I studied his face. He was serious, more serious than I had seen him in months. There was no hesitation in his eyes now, only a simmering determination. I whispered, "Be careful. If she suspects you are questioning her, she will turn it against you." He nodded, standing tall. "I will be careful, but I cannot let this go. If she had a hand in Dad's death, then everything she has said, everything she has done, has to be exposed." When he left that evening, I stayed at the table with the empty box and the dust that still lingered in the air. My fingers brushed the spot where the policy had lain. My mind kept circling back to Melissa's smirk at the community gathering, her casual way of speaking as though the farm was already hers. I walked to the porch and looked out across the land. The vines swayed gently in the breeze. They had weathered storms, droughts, and seasons of struggle. They were resilient. I wondered if I had that same resilience in me, if Daniel had inherited enough of his father's strength to face what was coming. The discovery of that policy was more than a paper in a box. It was a door cracked open, revealing shadows I had never dared to search. Melissa was not just ambitious, she might be dangerous. And Daniel, my only son, had finally begun to see it too. That night, I wrote in my journal again. The ink pressed heavy on the page. The farm is not my only battle. The truth about his death may be darker than I ever feared. And the one who laughs at me may be laughing because she thinks she has already won. I closed the book, my hand trembling slightly. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. The following week I tried to keep my days as steady as I could. The workers needed direction, the books needed balancing, and the vineyard did not care about the storms in my family. Still, every step felt heavier. I could not push away the thought of that policy Daniel had found. It hovered in my mind each time I walked past the shed or glanced at the empty chair at the kitchen table. Melissa, on the other hand, carried herself with even more confidence. She came by the farm twice that week, once unannounced. She walked through the rows as if she were inspecting them, her hand brushing against the vines, her heels sinking in the dirt. When she reached the porch, she smiled as though the land already belonged to her. "You cannot keep this up forever, Clara," she said one afternoon. "Running 900 acres alone? People are already talking. You will wear yourself down. Why not make it easier and let Daniel and me step in now?" I kept my voice calm. "This farm has lasted through droughts and storms. It will last through me too." Her smile tightened. "Stubbornness is not strength. You might find that out the hard way." She turned, her perfume trailing behind her as she left. I stood on the porch long after she was gone, her words echoing. Stubbornness. Was that what I had become? I thought of Daniel's eyes when he told me Melissa worried about me. Was she feeding him this same story every night, painting me as weak, fragile, incapable? The fear was not just that she might succeed in convincing him. It was that he might already believe her. A few days later, the church held another service. I almost stayed home, but habit drew me there. When I walked into the sanctuary, whispers followed. I caught pieces of them. "She looks tired. Maybe she should retire." Melissa sat proudly in the front pew beside Daniel, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if she owned not just him, but the air he breathed. During the fellowship afterward, I carried a plate of food to a table in the corner. I had barely sat down when I heard Melissa's voice again. She was speaking to a small group of women near the punch bowl. "Clara still insists on doing everything herself. It is sad, really. She should be enjoying her old age, not clinging to land she cannot manage. Daniel and I will take care of it soon enough." Laughter bubbled from the group. I stared down at my plate, my appetite gone. I wanted to rise, to tell them she was lying, that the farm was thriving. But my tongue felt heavy. Arguing with her in public would only turn pity into mockery. I told myself to stay still, to wait. There would be a time. That night, Daniel came to the house again. He looked worn, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. "Mum," he said, "you have to understand. Melissa is not trying to hurt you. She thinks about the future. She wants what is best for both of us. I met his eyes. And what about what is best for me? Does she ever think of that? He looked away. You are tired. I see it. You cannot keep doing this alone. Maybe letting go of part of the land would be a relief. The words cut deeper than any of Melissa's taunts. They came from my son, the boy I raised to run through these fields with joy in his steps. Now he stood before me, repeating her script. I wanted to shout, to remind him of the nights his father and I worked until our backs ached, the mornings we rose before the sun to tend the vines. Instead, I simply said, I am not ready. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. You never will be. When he left, the house felt emptier than ever. I sat at the table with the ledgers, but the numbers blurred. My hands trembled as I held the pen. I forced myself to breathe, to steady the pages, to write anyway. Routine was my anchor. Without it, I feared I might crumble. The next day, Melissa arrived again, this time with a folder in her hand. She laid it on the kitchen table without asking. These are documents for you to review, options for selling parcels of the land, small steps. You would still keep most of it, but it would free you from the pressure. Daniel and I already spoke with a realtor. I pushed the folder back toward her. This is not your decision. Her eyes glinted. You make it sound like you are the only one who matters, but the community is watching, Clara. They see you slipping. When the time comes, they will side with the ones who can actually manage this place. I clenched my hands in my lap, forcing myself not to react. She wanted me angry, wanted me to prove her story true. Instead, I rose slowly and said, Take your papers with you. The farm is not for sale. Her smile was thin and sharp. She gathered the folder, her heels clicking as she left. When the door closed, I sank back into my chair. The pressure was relentless, each visit another stone added to the weight already pressing on my chest. But even as fear gnawed at me, something else stirred beneath it. I had endured her cruelty, her laughter, her whispers. I had stayed silent, waiting. I was not ready to strike back yet, but the time was coming. For now, I would endure. I would let her think she was winning, let her build her case in front of the neighbors. Because deep inside I knew patience could be a weapon too. Daniel came by late one evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of gold and purple. He looked restless, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes shadowed with something I had not seen before. Mum, he said, standing in front of me, I cannot keep quiet anymore. I waited, my heart thudding. His voice carried a weight I had been hoping to hear. He pulled out the folded policy from his jacket. I have been digging. I went to the insurance office. They confirmed the beneficiary was changed 6 months before Dad's death, and the change was filed under Melissa's name. She handled the paperwork, not Dad. I felt my throat tighten. Are you certain? He nodded. As certain as I can be without standing in court. And that is not all. I found out she was near the accident site that night. She checked into a motel just a mile from where it happened. The clerk remembered her because she argued about the rate. My breath caught. The pieces fell together, dark and heavy. Melissa's laugh in church, her push to control the farm, her confidence. It all looked different now. Daniel sat down beside me, his elbows on his knees. I wanted to believe she cared about me. I wanted to think her pushiness was just ambition. But now, I think she is capable of more than I ever imagined. Silence stretched between us. The cicadas buzzed in the distance. I studied my son's face, seeing both anger and sorrow tangled together. Finally, I said, "What will you do with this knowledge?" He turned toward me, his jaw set. "I am not letting her take this farm, and I am not letting her get away with whatever role she played in Dad's death. I want to gather everything, every record, every witness, and when the time is right, I will confront her." I placed my hand over his. "Be careful, Daniel. She will not go down quietly. She will twist your words, twist mine, turn neighbors against us. We cannot act recklessly." He nodded, his eyes steady. "I know. That is why we need a plan. I have already spoken with a lawyer in town, someone I trust. He says we need more than suspicion. We need proof. Hard proof." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. My son, who had stood silent while Melissa mocked me, was finally ready to stand beside me. The next morning, we began quietly pulling things together. Daniel checked with the county office for accident reports. I combed through my husband's old files, looking for anything that showed his true intentions. We spoke little, but the silence between us was no longer heavy. It was focused, determined. At lunch, Daniel looked up from the papers and said, "I want you to know, Mum, I am sorry for standing by while she humiliated you, for doubting your strength. I see now what she has been doing, how she has been working to tear you down. I will not let her anymore." The words loosened something inside me, a knot that had been tightening since the day of the funeral. I touched his arm gently. "You are my son. That is enough. The rest can be mended." Later that week, Melissa showed up again, her smile sharp, her words smooth. She placed another folder on the table, this one filled with glossy photos of land developments and resort plans. "Imagine," she said, "what this farm could become if we sold. Daniel and I could take it to heights you never dreamed of." I kept my face neutral. Daniel glanced at me, then looked back at her. His voice was calm but firm. "We are not selling. Not now. Not ever." Melissa blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean, not selling? We have talked about this." "No," Daniel said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "You have talked about this. I listened, but I see things differently now." Her eyes flicked between us, suspicion clouding her features. She forced a laugh. "You are letting sentiment cloud judgment. This is about business, about profit." Daniel's expression did not waver. "This is about family, and you will not push my mother aside again." Her lips tightened. She gathered her folder, muttering under her breath as she stormed out. When the door closed, Daniel turned to me. "That was only the beginning. She will not stop. But I am ready this time. Ready to fight for you, for Dad, for this land." I studied his face, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the boy who once ran barefoot through the vines, fearless and free. The man he had become now carried that same spark, sharpened by loss and betrayal. I whispered, "Then we fight together." He nodded, his jaw firm, and in that moment I knew the tide had turned. Daniel and I began to move quietly, each of us taking on tasks that looked ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. He spent evenings at the county office, combing through accident reports and traffic camera records. I stayed at home with the ledgers and my husband's old files, searching for anything that might reveal his true intentions before he died. We did not speak much during those hours, but there was a rhythm between us, an understanding that silence was not emptiness. It was work. It was progress. One morning, Daniel returned with a stack of photocopies. He laid them on the kitchen table, his face tight. "I found something," A witness statement that was never followed up. A truck driver saw a car parked near the curve where Dad's accident happened. He described it as dark blue, mid-sized. Melissa drove a dark blue sedan back then. I stared at the page, my chest tightening. Why would the sheriff not investigate further? Daniel shook his head. The report says the lead went cold. No follow-up. Maybe it seemed unimportant at the time. But now, his voice trailed off. We sat there in silence for a long moment, the weight of the paper pressing on both of us. Then I said, "It is something. Not enough, but it is something." Later that week, I pulled out a box of receipts my husband had kept in the desk drawer. Buried beneath them was a small notebook, the leather worn soft. Inside were scribbled notes about harvests, equipment repairs, and meetings with suppliers. But near the back, I found a page dated just weeks before his death. In his handwriting, it said, "Melissa asked about policies again. Told her no. Clara and Daniel are the only ones who should benefit." My hands trembled as I read it. Proof, in his own words, that he had resisted her. I showed it to Daniel that night. He pressed his lips together, anger flashing in his eyes. She must have gone behind his back. She found a way to change it herself. We added the notebook to our growing file. Piece by piece, the shadows were taking shape. Daniel also began checking Melissa's phone records. He had a friend in town who owed him a favor, someone who could pull archived data. A week later, he came home with a printout. "Look," he said, pointing at the date of the accident. "She made 3 calls from a motel near the site, same time Dad was driving home." I leaned over the paper, my heart pounding. What do we do with this? He exhaled slowly. We build the case. We cannot confront her without being ready. She is clever, and she will twist anything we say. But if we gather enough, she will not be able to escape. Every day after that felt like walking a tightrope. Melissa still came by, still wore her confident smile, still spoke about the land as if it were hers. But now I watched her with new eyes. Each word she spoke seemed lined with deception. Each step across my porch felt like trespass. I said little, but inside I was counting the days until we could reveal what we knew. Daniel and I met with the lawyer in town. He was cautious but firm. "You have pieces, but you need more. Financial records, proof of forgery, witnesses willing to speak. If she changed those policies without consent, there will be a trail. People always leave trails." So Daniel requested copies of bank statements and credit records. I began talking quietly with neighbors who might have noticed unusual behavior. One worker remembered Melissa showing up at the farm office weeks before my husband's death, asking strange questions about insurance. Another neighbor recalled seeing her car on the highway the night of the accident, though she had told us she was out of town. Each fragment was small, but together they painted a picture of a woman circling, calculating, waiting for the moment to strike. At night, I wrote in my journal, my words steadier now. We are no longer standing still. We are building, step by step. The truth is within reach, and she does not even see it coming. One evening, Daniel sat across from me, his shoulders hunched, but his eyes bright. "I cannot believe how blind I was, Mum." "I let her convince me that you were weak, that you were clinging to something you could not manage. All the while she was plotting. She must have thought I would side with her forever." I touched his hand. "You see clearly now. That is what matters. The rest will take care of itself." Outside, the vines stretched across the land, silent witnesses to everything. They had stood through years of storms, through seasons of drought and harvest. And now, as Daniel and I pieced together the story, I felt the same endurance in myself. Melissa thought she had cornered me, thought she had silenced me with shame and whispers, but she had underestimated what I still carried inside. By the end of that week, our file had grown thick. Reports, phone records, the notebook, statements from neighbors. It was not yet complete, but it was enough to light the fire in us both. The plan was no longer a thought. It was forming, taking shape, ready to be set in motion when the time was right. The church was full that Sunday morning. The air buzzed with the low hum of voices, the shuffling of hymnals, the occasional cough echoing through the pews. I sat near the back, hands folded tight in my lap, my heart pounding harder than the organ that played. Melissa sat up front with Daniel, her head held high, her smile wide and polished for the congregation. She looked like the picture of confidence, as though she already owned the future she had been scheming for. The pastor spoke about faith and endurance, about the power of truth to outlast lies. His words fell heavy on me. I knew what was coming. Daniel and I had spent weeks preparing, gathering evidence, piecing together the fragments of her deception. We had chosen this moment for a reason. Melissa had humiliated me here, in this very place. Now it would be the place where the truth came to light. When the service ended and people moved toward the fellowship hall, I felt Daniel's hand brush against mine. He leaned close and whispered, "It's time." My legs felt heavy as I followed him into the hall. Long tables lined with food stretched down the room. Children ran between the adults, and voices rose in warm chatter. It looked like any other Sunday gathering. But today the air was tighter, like the calm before a storm. Melissa was already in the center of it all, her voice carrying above the rest. "Clara still insists on clinging to the land. It's tragic, really. She could be enjoying retirement, but instead she's pretending she can run it. Everyone knows she cannot keep up. Daniel and I will take care of things soon." A few people laughed, though others shifted uncomfortably. The words sliced through me, but this time I did not lower my head. Daniel straightened his shoulders, his jaw tight. He stepped forward, his voice ringing out clear. "Enough!" The room fell quiet. Melissa blinked, caught off guard, but quickly recovered. "Daniel," she said lightly, "I was only speaking the truth. Everyone here knows your mother is tired. We're just trying to help." Daniel held up a folder thick with papers. "Help? Is that what you call this? Forging Dad's signature to change a life insurance policy? Collecting payouts that were never meant for you? Lying about where you were the night of his accident?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Melissa's smile faltered, but she forced a laugh. "What are you talking about? That's absurd." Daniel's voice did not waver. "I went to the insurance office. I saw the records. The beneficiary was changed 6 months before Dad's death, and it was filed under your name. I have the clerk's testimony, and I have phone records showing you were at a motel a mile from where he crashed. You told me you were out of town, but you weren't. You were right there." Melissa's face flushed red. She turned to the crowd, her hands raised as if to calm them. "He's confused. He's grieving. You all know how loss can twist memories." But Daniel pressed on. "And there's more. Dad wrote in his own notebook that he refused to let you near his policies. He wrote that only Mom and I should benefit. His handwriting, his words, weeks before he died. Did you think we wouldn't find it?" The room was dead silent now. Every eye was on Melissa. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The confident smile she always wore slipped away, leaving her pale and stiff. One of the older men from the congregation stepped forward. "Is this true, Melissa? Were you near the site that night?" She stammered, I was visiting a friend. That motel. It was just a stop, nothing more. Daniel's voice cut through her excuses. You lied to me. You lied to all of us. And you laughed at my mother while carrying this secret. You thought no one would ever connect the pieces. But the truth has a way of rising, even when people try to bury it. Whispers spread through the crowd, growing louder. Some shook their heads, others muttered to each other. Melissa stood frozen, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally. But there were none. I stepped forward then, my hands trembling but my voice steady. For months I have endured your mockery, Melissa. You have spoken of me as weak, as useless. You thought you could take what my husband and I built, thought you could rewrite history in your favor. But history cannot be erased, and truth cannot be silenced. Melissa's lips parted, but no words came. Her mask had fallen, and the crowd saw her as she was. Daniel closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. This is going to the authorities, he said firmly. If you thought you could trick your way into our lives, you were wrong. You are finished, Melissa. The room erupted into murmurs, some shocked, some angry, all turning away from her. Melissa backed toward the door, her face pale, her steps unsteady. She tried to hold her head high, but the whispers followed her until she slipped out of sight. I stood in the center of that room, my son beside me. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt a weight lift. The truth was out. The shame that had been forced on me had been returned to its rightful owner. The neighbors came forward, some offering quiet words of support, others shaking Daniel's hand. The tide had turned. Melissa had been unmasked not in secret, but in the heart of the community she had tried to manipulate. When the hall began to empty, Daniel turned to me. His eyes were wet but steady. I should have done this sooner. I should have stood by you from the beginning. I reached for his hand. You stood by me when it mattered most. That's enough. As we walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the vines stretched in the distance, glistening under the light. The farm was still ours, still standing, and now the truth was standing with it. The storm had broken. What came next would not be easy, but it would be honest. And that, more than anything, gave me strength. The days after that Sunday were heavy with fallout. Word spread quickly through the community. Neighbors who once whispered about me now came by with quiet nods of respect, their eyes filled with something like shame for believing Melissa's words for so long. But the damage was already set in motion. Melissa's perfect image had cracked, and the pieces fell fast. On Monday morning, Daniel and I went to meet with the lawyer in town. We carried the file we had built, thick with records, statements, and that page from my husband's notebook. The lawyer listened carefully, flipping through each piece of evidence. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "This is strong. With the testimony and the paper trail, there's enough to push for a criminal investigation. At the very least, the insurance company will freeze the payout and pursue fraud." Daniel nodded, his jaw set. "Do it. She has walked free too long." The lawyer agreed to file immediately. As we left the office, I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because action was finally being taken, heavier because I knew Melissa would not go quietly. That evening, Daniel served her with divorce papers. She stormed onto the porch of our farmhouse just before sunset, her face twisted with rage. "You think you can destroy me?" she spat, her voice shaking. "You will regret this." Daniel stood in the doorway, calm but firm. "The only one who will regret anything is you. You betrayed me, you betrayed my family, and you betrayed the man whose death you tried to twist into your gain." She glared at both of us before turning sharply and leaving. The sound of her car tires squealing on the gravel was the last we heard of her that night. The next days brought more cracks in her story. The insurance company confirmed that the payout had been halted. The sheriff's office called Daniel to request more information. Neighbors who had once nodded politely at Melissa now avoided her entirely. In the grocery store, people turned away when she walked in. The confident smile she always wore was gone, replaced with a tight mask that fooled no one. At church the following Sunday, she did not show. People spoke openly about what Daniel had revealed. Some said they had suspected her, others admitted they had been blind. I listened quietly, not gloating, just absorbing the shift. For so long I had been the one whispered about. Now she was the one they judged, the one who could no longer hold her head high. Daniel worked with the lawyer to file for control of the disputed funds and to secure the farm's title against any claim she might attempt. He came home one evening with papers in his hand. "She cannot touch the farm anymore," he said with relief. "The court has recognized your ownership, and any challenge will be dismissed until the investigation is resolved." I sat at the kitchen table, tears stinging my eyes. For months I had lived under the shadow of her ambition. Now the shadow was lifting. But the fight took its toll on Daniel too. I saw it in his tired face, in the way he sat quietly at night, staring into the distance. One evening he finally spoke. "I can't believe I let her get this far, Mum. I thought I was protecting you, but really I was letting her poison me against you. I should have listened sooner." I placed my hand over his. "You came back to me when it mattered. That is what I will remember." Meanwhile, Melissa's life unraveled. Her friends stopped calling. Her job at the local bank quietly let her go after word of the investigation reached the board. I heard whispers that she had been staying at a motel on the edge of town, the same one she had visited the night of the accident. Irony had its way of circling back. The sheriff's office called me one afternoon to ask if I would be willing to testify about Melissa's behavior after my husband's death. I agreed. Sitting in that office, recounting the moments she laughed at me, the times she dismissed me as weak, I realized how much she had underestimated me. She thought silence meant surrender. She never understood that silence can also mean waiting, watching, preparing. By the end of that month, the community's opinion was firmly set. Melissa was no longer welcome at gatherings. Parents pulled their children close when she walked by. Even her own family stopped showing up with her in public. She was isolated, her web of control snapped thread by thread. For me, the change was profound. I could walk into church without feeling the sting of pity. I could stand at the market without hearing whispers behind my back. People greeted me with warmth again, some even apologizing for not standing up sooner. I did not hold it against them. I knew how easy it was to be swayed by a voice as smooth and confident as Melissa's once was. One evening I sat on the porch with Daniel, the sky painted orange and pink by the setting sun. The vines stretched out before us, steady and green. He looked at me and said, "She is finished, Mum. Whatever happens in court, she will never touch this family again." I nodded, my chest filling with something close to peace. The battle was not completely over, but the worst of it had passed. The truth had been spoken aloud, the lies torn apart in front of those who needed to hear them most. Melissa had laughed at me in church, mocked me in front of my neighbors, tried to take what was not hers. Now she was left with nothing but her own disgrace. The community she once tried to charm had turned away. The wealth she tried to steal was locked out of reach. The marriage she used to climb higher had collapsed. Justice was not swift, but it was certain. And as I looked out over the land my husband and I built, I knew it would stand long after her name was forgotten. The weeks that followed were quieter, though the echoes of everything that had happened still lingered around us. The farm moved at its steady rhythm, the workers coming in early each morning, the sound of tractors rolling across the fields, the rows of vines stretching toward the horizon. Life on the land did not pause for grief or conflict. It carried on, reminding me that survival was often about steady steps, not sudden victories. Daniel spent more time at the farm after filing for divorce. At first, he came out of duty, handling paperwork and speaking with the lawyer. But slowly, I saw him begin to reconnect with the land itself. One afternoon, I found him out by the southern rows, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands gripping a tool I had not seen him touch in years. "You do not have to do this," I said, walking toward him. He looked up, his face flushed but peaceful. "I know, but I want to. I forgot how much this place meant to me until I almost lost it." Those words carried more weight than he realized. For months, I had feared losing not just the farm, but him. Seeing him bend down to check the soil, hearing him speak with the workers about irrigation, I felt something heal inside me. In the evenings, we sat on the porch together, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The silence no longer hurt. It felt like a bridge being rebuilt, plank by plank. One night, Daniel broke the quiet. "Mum," he said, his voice low, "I owe you more than an apology. I stood by while she humiliated you. I let her words shape how I saw you. I was blind." I looked at him, the lines of guilt carved deep into his face. "You are here now. That matters more than what you failed to do then." "But I cannot forget it," he insisted. "When Dad died, I should have stood stronger. Instead, I let Melissa's voice drown out my own. I reached over and placed my hand on his. We all make mistakes, Daniel. What matters is that you chose differently when it counted. Your father would have been proud of you for that." His eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. The heaviness between us lifted just a little more. Around town, the whispers about Melissa grew faint. People stopped mentioning her name, except in passing. She had faded from the community she once tried to control. For me, the change was not about her absence, but about the presence of something stronger. Respect had returned. Neighbors no longer looked at me with pity. Instead, they looked at me with recognition, as if they finally understood the strength it had taken to stand through it all. One Saturday, the church hosted a small gathering to celebrate the harvest. Daniel and I went together. I carried a basket of grapes from the farm, the fruit gleaming in the afternoon light. When we arrived, people greeted us warmly. There was no pity in their voices, only kindness. Some even told Daniel they admired how he had stood up when it mattered. As I watched him speak with them, his head held high, I felt something in me settle. The wound Melissa had carved into my life had not destroyed me. Instead, it had revealed the core of what I carried, the endurance to survive, and the bond with my son that had bent but not broken. Later that night, after we returned home, Daniel lingered on the porch as I went inside. I watched him through the window. He stood quietly, looking out over the fields, his posture relaxed in a way I had not seen in years. I knew then that the farm had claimed him again, not as a burden, but as a part of him. In the weeks that followed, we began making plans for the future. Daniel suggested repairs to the barn, updates to the irrigation system, even a small tasting room on the edge of the vineyard to bring visitors. His ideas carried energy, not greed. I could hear my husband's voice in them, the same excitement he used to have when we dreamed together about what the farm could become. One evening, Daniel turned to me and said, "I want to carry this forward with you, not to take it from you, not to push you aside, but to stand with you. I want this farm to be our story, not hers." Tears filled my eyes, though I tried to hold them back. That is all I ever wanted, I whispered. The healing was not just between us. It was within me, too. For months I had felt broken, humiliated, silenced. But now, as I walked through the vineyard in the early mornings, I felt steady again. The rows no longer looked like questions about the future. They looked like promises, promises of seasons to come, of harvests not yet made, of strength that would not falter. The land had carried us through storms, through betrayal, through loss. It would carry us still. And standing beside me, my son was no longer divided. He was mine again, his loyalty unshaken, his voice clear. I wrote in my journal one night, "Healing does not come quickly. It comes in quiet moments, in steady steps, in the choice to stand together after nearly falling apart. Tonight, I am not alone. Tonight, the farm is not just mine. It is ours." The lamp flickered gently as I closed the book. Outside the window, the vines stretched under the moonlight, patient and eternal. For the first time since my husband's death, I let myself breathe without the weight of fear. The road ahead would not be simple, but it would be shared, and that was enough. Winter settled slowly over the vineyard, the rows of vines resting under a pale sky. Life on the farm did not stop, but the pace eased, giving me time to breathe. The storm that Melissa had brought into our lives had passed, leaving behind scars but also lessons. The community no longer looked at me with pity. They spoke with respect, sometimes even admiration. Daniel was at my side almost every day, and the bond between us felt stronger than it had in years. One morning, while I was pruning near the porch, I saw a car pull up on the gravel drive. It was Melissa. She stepped out, not in her usual bright clothes, but in a simple coat, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. For a moment I thought she might lash out again, but her steps were slow, careful. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me. "I need to talk," she said quietly. Daniel came from the barn when he saw her car, his face tense. "You should leave, Melissa," he said firmly. She shook her head. "I am not here to fight. I have lost everything. The insurance money is gone, the community wants nothing to do with me, and the divorce is nearly final. I came to say I was wrong." Her voice trembled. For the first time, I saw no pride in her, no mocking smile. Just a woman stripped of all her schemes, standing in the ruin she had created. I set down my shears and stepped closer. "You hurt this family more than you can imagine. You tried to turn my son against me. You mocked me when I was grieving, and you twisted the truth for your gain." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know. I thought I was smart enough to take control. I thought money would fill the emptiness I carried. But all it did was destroy what I had. I do not expect forgiveness. I just needed to admit it." Daniel's jaw clenched, his anger still raw. "Do you realize what you put us through? Do you understand what you cost us?" Melissa looked at him and nodded slowly. "Yes, and I live with that every day." The silence stretched, heavy but honest. I felt the weight of it pressing down, but also the faintest sense of release. For months I had wished for this moment, not for revenge, but for the truth to be spoken plainly. I drew a breath. "Melissa, forgiveness is not easy. It is not forgetting. But I will not carry hatred for you. It would only poison what is left of my life. I will carry on, and you will have to find your own way forward." Her shoulders sagged, relief flickering across her tired face. "That is more than I deserve," she whispered. She turned to Daniel. "I know I cannot undo what I did to you, but I hope someday you can see me as more than the worst parts of myself." Daniel said nothing, but his silence was not as sharp as before. He simply nodded once, a sign that he had heard her. Melissa left soon after, her car disappearing down the long road lined with bare vines. I stood there a long time, watching the dust settle, my heart both heavy and lighter. That evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch, the sky painted with streaks of pink and gold. He leaned back in his chair, his voice softer than I had heard in months. "Do you think she meant it, Mum?" I thought about her face, the cracks in her voice. "I think she is broken, and sometimes being broken is the only way someone can begin to change." He nodded slowly. "I am not ready to forgive her, but I do not feel the same anger I did before." I placed my hand over his. "That is enough for now. Time will do the rest." The vineyard stretched before us, quiet and patient. It had carried us through grief, through betrayal, through the storm of lies. Now it stood as a promise of renewal. I felt peace settle over me, knowing that the truth had prevailed, that justice had been served, and that even in the face of cruelty, forgiveness was still possible. I wrote in my journal that night, "The farm is still here. My son is still here. And even the one who tried to break us has faced her truth. Justice has its place, but so does mercy. And in mercy, I find my own freedom." What would you have done in my place? Some people believe forgiveness is weakness, while others see it as the only path to peace. I chose not to carry hatred, because hatred would have only taken more from me. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting, and it does not erase justice. If you were standing on that porch, with the person who betrayed you asking for mercy, would you give it? Or would you turn them away forever? Think about it, and let me know what your heart tells you.